Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the International Spy Museum. My name is Vince Houghton. I'm the historian and curator here at the Spy Museum. Is anyone here for the first time at the Spy Museum? Well, welcome. Good to see you. Special welcome to you. Anyone to one of our programs for the first time? Okay, well, welcome to a program. This summer, the programs are somewhat spread out, but in the fall season, we have a bunch of really great programming. So if you want to go check out what we're doing this fall, spymuseum.org. We have a bunch of really exciting stuff coming up. That's your way to keep in touch with what we're doing here at the Spy Museum. So I'm going to introduce our author, Curtis J. James, the pseudonym for the three men sitting next to me here. And I guess I'll go in order from my left. James Rosen is an award-winning political journalist. He's covered major stories of our era, from the collapse of the Soviet Union to the post-9/11 wars and the current military campaign against ISIS. He's based here in D.C., so he didn't have to come far, thankfully, with the McClatchy Company and its 29 daily newspapers, including my hometown paper, the Miami Herald, so I've known you for a while. He previously served as a Moscow correspondent for the United Press International and is fluent in Russian. Privyet. To his left is Curtis Harris, a world-renowned cancer scientist. Harris delivers lectures and collaborates with researchers around the globe. He is chief of the Laboratory of Human Carcinogenesis at the NIH, National Cancer Institute, and serves as editor-in-chief of the scientific journal Carcinogenesis. I'm so happy I pronounced that correctly.
Did it great.
Well.
Yes.
Did well.
And then finally, James Ellenberger is a former senior official of a National Labor Federation. He served in numerous positions at the AFL-CIO, including Asian representative and assistant director for occupational safety and health. He later served as deputy commissioner of the Virginia Employment Commission under former governor and now U.S. Senator Mark Warner. So help me in welcoming all three of these guys. Curtis J. James. So if you didn't know it already, they are the co-authors of the new spy thriller High Hand, which I had the pleasure of reading a couple weeks ago when it first got to me. We're always kind of hesitant when we get a new spy thriller. We get a lot of them here. Many of them are complete garbage. Some of them stand out, and this was certainly one that did. You could tell there was a lot of understanding of the way the world worked behind this book. And that's one of the themes that I want to touch upon as we talk here. And I'll start with you, Jim Rosen. This book really centers on a relationship between intelligence agencies, primarily the CIA, and journalism, which you know a lot about. Why focus on such a link? And kind of as a sub-question, as a journalist, have you seen empirically the real-world connections for this kind of give-and-take dynamic between intelligence agencies and journalism?
Well, it's a delicate area, but especially reporters who cover national security, not only the CIA, but since 9/11, since the 9/11 attacks, the intelligence agencies have greatly expanded, and reporters and members of the intelligence community, especially senior members, they have a lot in common. They have sources that they have to cultivate. They have to talk with their sources. They have to do a lot of research, both reading and talking with people. When I was based in Washington, it's very much like in Moscow in some ways. When I was based in Moscow some years ago, I would be at the U.S. Embassy, and I'd have a long conversation with some interesting fellow who would introduce himself as the economic attaché. And a day or two later, another embassy person or another reporter would pull me aside and whisper into my ear, you know, he's not really an economic attaché. And I often, partly because of that experience, and I've had similar experiences with Soviet officials when I was based in Moscow and when I've returned for reporting, you kind of assume when you're in Russia, both under the communists and now under President Putin, you kind of assume that any officials who are minding you, that's the term of art, are not who they say they are. At least if you're a reporter in my position, and I think someone in Kurt and Jim's positions, they'd get the same treatment. But you kind of, here in Washington, it's such a fascinating, complex town with the entire federal government based here that you can't assume that anybody is who they say they are. There are a lot of cover positions and so forth.
When someone introduces themselves as the fifth secretary from the like, how many secretaries do you need? Or the second deputy agricultural attaché. Let me.
So Jim, who are you?
I'll never tell.
I've got follow-ups for all these questions, but let me go down the line a little bit, because another major theme of this book is it really focuses on a heavy dose of scientific development of technology to tell its story. So as a scientist, Dr. Harris, I'd like to ask you, how much of what you wrote is based on reality? Because a lot of it kind of feels futuristic, but in the same respect, there's always that cutting edge when it comes to intelligence agencies. So,
But most of it actually is very realistic, and the various poisons or alkaloids that are described, the science in terms of computer to brain and brain to computer, that was science fiction for many years, and it still is. However, it's reached reality, because now brainwaves can, through a computer, through machines, help wounded warriors, people who are quadriplegic, to walk and move their arms. And so what was science fiction 10 years ago, 20 years ago, is reality today.
and it's hard not to think of the implications of that, where if you can find ways to communicate, it's not telepathically, but using brain waves, using this kind of technology, life would be a lot easier for military soldiers on the battlefield, not having to yell out or use radios that can be hacked or intercepted, for spies to actually be able to communicate without, meeting or dead drops or signals, all the things that play a role there.
Yeah, but for every science and technology, there's a counter.
Right.
And so to be able to actually determine what someone else is thinking may actually become reality too.
So let me go down the line, and James, you were a labor union official, so people might say, what does that have to do with intelligence? But there's a huge connection between labor unions and intelligence. Can you, in a broad sense, kind of talk a little bit about that?
A lot of you might say, well, what do unions and the world of espionage have to do with one another? When I started out in the International Affairs Department at the AFL-CIO, and one of my first assignments was to live in the Philippines and work with Philippine unions. And while we were there, my wife and I had 2 children. My daughter was 5 or 6, and somebody asked her once, well, who does your daddy work for? And she said, oh, the AFL-CIA. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who had charged in the past, and even charged today, that the AFL-CIO, in fact, was in concert with the CIA on a number of issues. And I don't want to say definitively yes or no, but certainly there was, without a doubt, a lot of cooperation, and cooperation that turned out to be very positive from the viewpoint of American history. My first boss at the AFL-CIO was a fellow named Jay Lovestone, and Jay was one of the founding members of the American Communist Party. He was purged from the party by Joseph Stalin. He had to sneak out of the Soviet Union. He and Bertram Wolfe, who some of you may recognize that name, he wrote the definitive biography of Diego Rivera, the famous Mexican muralist who was also a communist. And he wrote the famous book, Three Who Made a Revolution. Jay Lovestone and his colleagues at the time, this was immediately following World War II, were the difference between the unions in Germany and Italy and France becoming communist or staying anti-communist. And that had a lot to do with the AFL and, in fact, the CIO, which were separate at the time.
Well, and I think that, let me continue with the follow-up question with you, because people don't quite realize the covert partnership that existed, particularly in those countries. Because after World War II, the economies of most of Western Europe were destroyed. And the only way to keep them in the Western sphere would try to rebuild the economies, which involved labor, which involved finding jobs for people. So these guys wouldn't vote in a communist government inside France or Italy, other places. How much did labor, there's a famous covert action by the CIA called the Italian Job, where they worked to ensure the right Italians were elected inside Italy. How much did labor play a role in helping to rebuild Europe after the war?
Labor played a key role, and it goes right to the heart of the issues you raised. The economies were in shambles in Europe, and one of the things that got them back on their feet was the Marshall Plan. And the Soviet Union and the communist unions in Western Europe, and obviously the ones in Eastern Europe, which were under the thumb of the Soviets, fought to defeat or deny the unloading of ships to defeat the Marshall Plan. And the AFL and the CIO were working with unions in France in particular to open up the ports. The dock workers unions were controlled by the communists, and they got separate unions that were non-communist, socialist, but non-communist, to work to open the ports and eventually get the flow of goods and food back into Europe to get them back on their feet. In terms of elections, unions were involved in the elections in their own countries, and it was very important to have unions that were not controlled by the Communist Party.
So Kurt, let me ask you this question, because when I was reading the book and thinking about all these new technologies that could affect the way people behave, the way people communicate, I as a person who studies science and technological history, it always kind of scares me a little when intelligence agencies begin to work with things that can change the way we think, the way we act. And it harkens back to thinking about MK Ultra during the early Cold War, which, if you don't know, was the CIA's attempt to create a mind control program, and usually using high-level drugs like LSD. How do we avoid in the next 10, 15 years, as neuroscience continues to evolve, how do we avoid these kind of abuses? How do we avoid turning great potential developments that are for paraplegics or for things that could be used into another MK Ultra, where we're using it to do nefarious things around the world?
That's a great question, not only in terms of intelligence, but in terms of the populace in general, and the role of cybersecurity is another example of that. What you were talking about, they used two things. One is drugs, and the second was electric shock therapy, and which is quite brutal, and with convulsions, and the bottom of all that is it didn't work. Now, there are new kinds of technologies that are coming available that are actually in the clinic now, magnetic transcranial stimulation. And it's used for various purposes, including treating depression. But it can also be used to focus on very specific areas in the brain that might actually improve your ability to concentrate, and on other areas of the brain that can give you the action to carry out and the emphasis to carry out an action. So those kinds of studies are being done in animal models now and in some humans. And where that's going to go, that's a very interesting question, and something that involves ethics and involves communication, and we'll see.
Well, it immediately brings to mind the Bourne movies, where there's brainwashed, and then later with Jeremy Renner, he takes the pills that gives him extra aggression and almost superhuman strength. I know that's science fiction. I know that's, but we're almost on the cusp of that today, where we're finding ways, like you mentioned, to hone in on certain areas of the brain of that are aggression, overcoming fear as an impulse.
Yeah. Well, the brain and neuroscience is a very exciting area of research for studying Alzheimer's and a whole variety of different things. So we're still mapping the circuits within the brain and understanding how they connect with each other, and how that connects with personality, how that connects with focus and concentration. And these are things that are moving ahead fairly rapidly. And we'll see where it goes over the next 10 years. We'll have some surprises.
Let me ask you a multi-part question. You can answer it whatever order you want to, but I think there's an interesting connection here. When I studied intelligence history, always taught that journalists or CIA agents were forbidden from using journalists as their cover. And this is more recent, but this is certainly something that's not smiled upon, because journalists, somewhat are already considered in many places spies in their own right. But I want to ask you about the bit of a relationship. Where is that line? You've already talked a little bit about it, but I'm thinking about stations like Russia Today, where it is clearly a propaganda mouthpiece of the Putin regime, and CCTV, which is a state-controlled Chinese television station, where these aren't journalists by anything that the Columbia School of Journalism would define as journalists. Here in the United States, we're not quite at the level, but you do have Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, where it is a mouthpiece of the United States government and our goals. Where is that line? And how do you cover intelligence without, how do you toe that line? I know it's a very complicated question. I'm trying to make it simple. I'm trying to get across what I'm trying to say is, how do you walk that very fine line becoming a sort of a mouthpiece for intelligence community or the administration and actually covering them?
It's actually a very interesting question. I've been thinking about it a lot. I think American political journalists are schizophrenic because I think in some ways too much we just report what we're told by officials in the executive branch, the various executive agencies, the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, and beyond, and also by members of Congress and their aides. And we're all under, I see my friends Mike Collins, Joey Warwick, probably missing some other journalists in the audience, but we're all under enormous time pressure now because of the financial pressures that journalism is under. It's having trouble producing revenues from the internet because of how fast we're expected to turn our stories, get things up online. Our readers and our viewers and our listeners' attention spans are shorter than they were even 10 years ago. And so all of those pressures push in the direction of less critical analysis of what you're told, just not being a conveyor belt, but moving things quickly. And it's a great frustration as a daily journalist, especially, that you have less time. You have less time to analyze, to make outside calls, get a range of opinions, and so forth. So that's one side of the coin. And I said that we're somewhat schizophrenic. The other side of the coin is that I often feel like only negative reporting on the government is allowed. That you have to be critical. You have to be negative. You only report bad news. You only report things that go wrong. And I'll give an example. During the so-called scandal, there's so many scandals now. During some of which are not full scandals, but during the scandal over records of doctored records at veterans' hospitals and other healthcare facilities. Well, the veterans' healthcare system is the largest healthcare system by far in the country, and it may be in the world the largest healthcare system. And it treats. I have friends who are veterans.
I get all my healthcare through the VA. So
right, and it treats millions and millions of veterans at a very high level without very high compensation. I mean, the doctors who work for the Veterans Administration take huge pay cuts to do so, and yet all of that good stuff is not routinely reported on because that's what they're supposed to do, right? That's not news. And if the sun rises in the morning, well, that's not a reportable event. But when somebody screws up, then that's news. And so I think that I've had a lot of I won't say arguments, but I've had a lot of discussions with editors, and I admire my company, McClatchy. I think it's one of the best and most independent that there is. But it's very hard to convince editors sometimes to report on good things that government is doing, because the response that you get is, well, they're just doing what they're supposed to do. And I would argue that actually things have flipped around so much in the age of Donald Trump that things have flipped around, that the expectation of the American people is that the government agencies are going to routinely screw up and waste our money. So I would argue that what's actually true is when they do something well, it's not what most people expect. It's not what they're supposed to do in the minds of readers.
Right.
That's why I think they're doing those sorts of good stories, if you will, are actually they've become counterintuitive. So I gave a long, complicated answer.
No, and I even have a follow-up to your long, complicated answer. And I think in the intelligence world, it's even more difficult to write positive stories because rarely do we find out about any kind of intelligence operation unless it screws up, unless it fails, unless it's a disaster.
September 11th being the famous worst example.
Because in most cases, the intelligence agencies protect their sources and methods and don't want it advertised if they're doing well. Let me ask you a very brief, relatively follow-up that maybe or not your answer will be brief, but how is the relationship between the Russian journalists and the Russian government today? Other than them all getting bumped off, and I was going to save that question for Kurt because that was a more medical question. But, what do you see somewhat similar relationship there, or is it completely state controlled?
Well, unfortunately, some of the most courageous and famous Russian journalists have been killed, they've just disappeared.
Right.
Or they've been murdered by people that I could be wrong, and if someone in the audience can correct me, that would be great. But I think since President Putin took power, I don't think that there has been a single, forget about conviction, I'm not sure there's been a single indictment for the murder of a journalist. If there has been, it's few and far between. And you can imagine in America, not that our government's perfect, but you can imagine if one of the most famous journalists in the country was murdered. You can imagine how strange that would be. So I think the message has, now it's nowhere near as bad. There's once Russia invaded Ukraine, you started seeing stories, are we back in the Cold War with their intervention in Syria and so forth. There's no comparison. It's nowhere, our relationship is nowhere near as fraught as it was during the Cold War. And Putin's government, for all of its problems and bad things, is nowhere, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, is nowhere near as evil as Stalin's government. Okay, so these are orders of magnitude difference. But
Really setting a high bar.
right, or a low bar.
Yeah.
But having said that, I think the message has gone out very clearly to Russian journalists that if you do serious investigative probing reporting, not only on the Russian government, but on some of the very rich oligarchs who have close ties to government officials, you are putting your life in danger.
Well, and life in danger takes on a whole new meaning. This is not where Trotsky was getting popped in the head with an ice axe. You're now seeing, and this is for Kurt, you're now seeing science taken to a pretty nefarious level with people like Litvinenko being poisoned with polonium, where things that usually are considered outside of the realm of intelligence agencies are now being employed for these lethal action purposes. Is that something that we're seeing more of, or do we expect that high-level scientific discoveries will be turned bad in the end?
Yeah, Jim mentioned the fact that people disappear. That's one aspect. But someone like Lysenko, polonium-210, he lived another week or two and died a really terrible death. And that was a very unusual way of killing people. Usually it's something much more quickly, from throwing people off a 10-story building to injection of, in the olden days, ricin with a, this even made a James Bond movie that had this with an umbrella, or different kinds of toxins. And in our book, High Hand, we use one of these toxins. I won't divulge exactly what it is. You have to read it. But there are many different ways of killing people that are sometimes very difficult to ascertain.
Well, it's easy to make the Russians the boogeyman, but the United States, especially in its policies against Fidel Castro, employed many of these same tactics, whether it was botulism in a wetsuit or thallium salts in his shoes to make his beard fall out. as the idea would be he'd be less macho if he had no beard. So we did a lot to invent some of these things, but you see now polonium's really taking it to the next level.
Yes. Well, that's just an example, but one can envision many more various ways of killing people that involve some of our biosecurity and biowarfare. That's all coming back again. That was well funded with botulism and various other things up at Fort Detrick, not too far from here, and other places. It's evolving.
Is NIH an agency, and this might be a little too inside baseball, is NIH an agency that's gearing up for that, or is, I mean, for that potential future in 10, 15 years where there's a potential terrorist attack with biological weapons, or?
Yeah, that's one of the goals in terms of biosafety, and includes infectious agents. It includes alkaloids and toxins of various kinds, and so those are real world concerns and problems. And just as we have to have improved cybersecurity, we need better biosecurity.
So James, let me wrap this question up with you and then we'll go to the audience. But I think there'd be no surprise to anyone talking about the fact that labor unions have political agendas. And I think that the surprise may actually be that the lowest labor unions are considered very left-wing, and the fact that you are working somewhat hand-in-hand with intelligence agencies may be a surprise. But let me go beyond that. How much influence or how much dog in the fight do labor unions have when it comes to foreign policy and influencing the way the United States deals with other countries? Because I think that might be something that people don't know a whole lot about, and that's another reason where, you know, international relations and diplomacy go hand in hand with American labor.
Well, there are a number of examples where labor unions have influenced their national governments in terms of domestic policy and also in terms of foreign policy. That's true in the United States for sure. I brought along a book called A Covert Life, Jay Lovestone, Communist, Anti-Communist Spy Master, which details a number of specific instances in the United States where unions that were in the AFL, and particularly unions like the ILGW and David Dubinsky, who was an immigrant from Poland, were very involved in U.S. foreign policy, whether it was the resettlement of refugees after World War II or recognition of new countries or anti-colonialism. The labor movement was very strong against any effort to reestablish colonial empires after World War II. And if we had been we were quite successful in many instances, but we were unsuccessful in perhaps the most important instance, and that was Indochina and Vietnam. Because for whatever reason, the United States decided to support the French in their reimposition of their colony in Vietnam, and it had tragic consequences for the United States.
I mean, is that, you talked historically, but is that still the case? I know you're not with the AFL-CIO anymore, but do you still see labor unions, because they've fallen off a bit in the United States, but do you still see them having that similar impact on foreign policy, not just intelligence related, but, you know, whether it's trade deals, whether it's the books around that give away the plot too much, oil, right? A lot of it's Russian oil, a lot of it's there. I mean, the conversations about clean energy, about getting off Middle Eastern oil, these are big foreign policy questions. How involved today are labor unions in pushing for policy?
It's a great question. Unions, you mentioned trade. Obviously, unions are very involved in issues involving trade, and they lobby their members of Congress and they lobby the administration. But it doesn't stop there. They're very involved in issues involving energy, alternative sources of energy, particularly where it concerns jobs of their members. It wouldn't surprise anyone that the United Mine Workers of America is pretty apoplectic about what's happening to coal in this country. That's not going to change because of their position, and it's a shrinking union that probably isn't going to be around in another 10 or 15 years. But there's undoubtedly going to be workers in energy who will need representation in the future, whether it's solar energy or wind energy or conversion of wave power or whatever. So unions are very involved. And if I might just touch a little bit further on something related to that question. It's not uncommon for unionists to emerge in politics. Not so much in the United States, but it's happened frequently in other countries. Brazil, we had Ignacio Lula da Silva, the metal worker, became president of Brazil. We had in Australia Bob Hawke, the head of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, become prime minister for 4 terms. We had Wim Kok in the Netherlands become prime minister. We had Golda Meir become prime minister of Israel. She was out of the teachers union.
Lech Walesa.
Lech Walesa, the head of
Solidarity,
Solidarność, and a recipient of a lot of international aid from unions.
And from the CIA. Yeah.
I suspect from the CIA. But,
That made the perfect segue. We're going to kick it out now to the audience. Do you have a mic? So Amanda has a microphone, so raise your hand if you have a question for anyone up here of the authors. They're right in front.
Tony.
I'm just curious how you guys got together. You're kind of from varied backgrounds. I'm just wondering what phenomenon of human nature brought you together.
It's a reporter's question. I neglected to mention, I feel badly because I cited a couple journalist friends of mine in the audience, and I was skipped over Tony. Tony's a colleague of mine and a close friend.
well, let me take a quick stab because Jim's colleague at the Miami Herald introduced us at an event at Books and Books in Coral Gables. And he said, how did it happen that 3 guys wrote a book? He said, well, there are 3 guys that went into a bar, a journalist, a cancer scientist, and a trade unionist. After a couple of pitchers of beer, they came out and had a outline of a novel. Not too far from the truth. Go ahead, Kurt.
Yeah, well, the story is that it's a collaboration, and I initiated the collaboration for a very interesting purpose, which we won't discuss today. And with this initial storyline and bios of the main characters, and convinced Jim Rosen that this is a good thing to do, would be interesting. And because we all play squash rackets, we've been friends for 20 years or so. And he finally said yes, and we said, well, let's get Jim Ellenberger. And then we said, well, how are we going to write a novel together? And the idea was, well, let's go up and write a screenplay together, and let's go up in the mountains and storybook it. And we did that, and very long days, and big pads of paper, and we ended up with 50 scenes. And then we wrote the screenplay, we had the dialogue between us, and so on and so forth. And then we went the next step, and that's to write the novel. We divided it up into 3s, and we each wrote things that we had experience with, because we want to intertwine reality with fiction, and that the locations were real ones, places that we'd been. And if you go there today, you'll find exactly what we have in the novel. And so that led to, well, okay, so we have all this put together. We need to be harmonized. And Jim Rosen was chosen to do that, and we got a good editor. And then we set it aside for a period of time. We manipulated it, improved it, and then we waited for this 2016 election, because that's where that's the time the novel takes place.
So you wrote the screenplay before you wrote the novel,
Yep.
so it's ready for Hollywood already, is what we're saying. Yeah.
The novel is a lot different than the screenplay. When we wrote the screenplay, we thought we knew what we were doing, and we found out over time we had no idea what we were doing. In fact, we found out that almost everything we did was wrong, from the technical way that one writes a screenplay to all sorts of other things that I won't go into. But it did serve, and we did pitch it with no success to Hollywood. We actually are more hopeful of some success now that it's a book. But it did serve an important purpose, which was that it basically, the screenplay was a skeleton of the book. And although the book has evolved quite a bit, there were some scenes about China that got axed in the book form that may come back later, and a lot of changes. But it gave us a basic skeleton to build from.
Well, at least you didn't all quit your jobs and move to LA and try to write screenplays there.
Right.
Question over there. Let Amanda bring the mic so we can hear.
Thank you so much for your interesting and thoughtful presentation. What do you think about the coordination or lack of coordination among various U.S. government agencies that deal with intelligence?
Well, first of all, can you even name the large number
We should repeat
that
the
are?
question.
Yeah, so the question is about the coordination or lack of coordination between all the different intelligence agencies.
So there's 20 some now, that's and so and there's there's someone who's head of all of it. I go to the Aspen Security Forum every year, and it's really interesting to see the interaction between these people and Homeland Security and so on and so forth. So it's grown dramatically. Is the CIA as important as it used to be? That's a matter of debate. And is the coordination effective? That's a matter of debate. And maybe some of you have a better idea of that than I do.
Let me add to that. The criticism after the 9/11 attacks, and I covered a lot of the criticism in Congress and beyond. There was a special commission that was set up. You might remember, a Blue Ribbon Commission. And one of the main criticisms that came out of it was that intelligence was what was called stovepiped. So you had these different agencies working by themselves, but they didn't share information with one another. It went up and down the chain of commands within the intelligence agencies. And all that was supposed to change. President Bush pushed through one of the biggest restructurings of government in the history of the United States with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And that was supposed to coordinate and combine the intelligence agencies and so forth, and prevent another situation where our intelligence agencies, and again, it's like you said earlier, they do a lot of great things that we don't know, right? So they're in an unfair, disadvantageous position. But you'd think they should have known in advance that Al-Qaeda was a huge threat to us, bigger threat than they apparently thought. Now there was 11th hour quarterbacking, next day quarterbacking that President Bush, in particular, in his first months in office, was warned very strongly by our intelligence agencies about Al-Qaeda, and did not act sufficiently. But clearly, Al-Qaeda was a bigger threat than our intelligence agencies knew. And so all of that was supposed to be fixed with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and greater coordination. There's a place I visited not far from here, if I remember, in the Virginia suburbs somewhere, called the National Terrorism Center. And these different agencies have high-level people that are watching stuff in real time together and talking to each other and so forth. And yet, despite that, what did they miss in the last couple years? They missed the rise of the Islamic State. My friend Joby Warwick had a book come out last year, won the Pulitzer Prize. He'll kill me for saying that, but it's a great book. And his book focuses a lot on the same sort of thing, how the various intelligence agencies, not just in America, but in Israel and our Western allies, how we missed the very rapid rise of a threat as large as the Islamic State in the middle of the Middle East. And in many ways, ISIS, the Islamic State, as we're seeing with these various attacks, is a greater threat to us than Al-Qaeda. So the intelligence agencies, and I still hear that the intelligence agencies, even though they're within this one big Department of Homeland, still don't share information with each other and are still very territorial. So, I don't know what the answer is.
It's gotten better. I mean, with the IRTPA, which is the 2004 Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, the IRTPA.
Wow.
That not only created the Department of Homeland Security, but also created the ODNI, the Office of Director
Right.
of National Intelligence,
Yeah.
which is supposed to be this kind of umbrella organization over the 16, 17, I don't know how many, depending on the way you count it, different agencies in the United States. And the problem is, how do you prove a negative? A lot of people argue, well, we haven't been hit again since 9/11, so they're obviously doing their job. And it's clear that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been trying to hit us since 9/11. It's not like they're like, we'll take tomorrow off. But again, that's the difficulty. The reason I asked you that question earlier was, how do you actually write good stories about the community when a lot of the successes are being kept secret?
Well, we were hit in San Bernardino. We were hit in Orlando. The question is, were those orchestrated in some way, or were they so-called lone wolf attacks, or something in between? I mean, ISIS has a manual on how to pull off lone wolf attacks that particularly the shooter in Orlando appears to have followed somewhat closely. And I think one of the things that has surprised all of us since 9/11, and Joby touched on this a little bit in his book, is that the kinds of attacks that we've seen recently, San Bernardino, Paris, Orlando, Brussels, that those didn't start happening earlier, and that we haven't seen more of them. And just as Kurt has some fear about the future use of science and pathogens in nefarious ways, I have a fear that we're going to, unfortunately, I think we're going to be seeing more of these kind of lone wolf attacks that are either inspired by ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or in a more loose way directed by them.
And I think we should hasten to add that the failure of coordination of intelligence isn't just our problem. It's a problem that we share with our allies. And two other events, very recent, that have gotten far less scrutiny and attention than the events here, but deserve, and the events in Europe, but deserve at least as much, are the events in Istanbul and Iraq, where hundreds.
Well, it's almost, every day in Iraq now. But yeah, you certainly had that massive attack earlier, and then in Turkey as well.
And there's one more problem, and I'm going to wade into some controversial areas here. But Turkey is a NATO ally. It's the only Muslim country in NATO. Saudi Arabia is an ally, quote unquote, and yet and there's other countries, Pakistan, that are allies, and they, depending on who you talk to, they either don't do nearly enough to control their radical jihadists, or sometimes are, I don't want to be too controversial here, sometimes thank you, or sometimes are enablers in order to stay in power, as the price of staying in power. And that's a huge problem, right? Because Jim talked about not sharing intelligence. I think that the governments, like those three countries, and I could name others, that are closest to the source and have the best information, I don't think they tell us what they know. And I don't know what we do about it, but it's a big problem.
There's a question down here, Amanda. He's come. Yeah, he's come.
First, a small comment on the list of national leaders who were earlier Union leaders, along with, for instance, Golda Meir, Lula da Silva, is Ronald Reagan, who had the Screen Actors Guild. And
I purposely left him off the list.
I don't blame. I blame you, Jim. I have a question for you and for your colleagues. Some of us here are trade unionists, and we're certainly friends of yours. I'm curious to what extent and in what specific ways your background in the trade union movement is part of the book?
That's a good question, because there's obviously the answers you've heard already from Jim and from Kurt have given you a clear sense how their backgrounds have appeared in the book. Less so with my background working in the labor movement, because we don't talk about unions in any way, shape, or form. But the book did give me an opportunity to weave into the narrative some things that I had direct experience with or knowledge of. The Northern Territories in Japan, for example. I represented the AFL-CIO at a rally in the northern part of Hokkaido back in the 70s, demanding that the Soviet Union return 4 northern territories to Japan. These were 4 islands seized by the Soviet Union right at the end of World War II. We mentioned in the book the Bamiyan Buddhas in Bamiyan Valley in Afghanistan that were blown up and obliterated by the Taliban in 2001. I visited Bamiyan Valley on my way home from Vietnam. I was separated from the army in Vietnam, and I chose to stay in Asia and travel to Iran before I came home. And I stopped in Afghanistan, and I went with a British archaeologist and 2 Israeli friends of mine to Bamiyan Valley and to the Hindu Kush and Bandi Amir. And I got to see the Bamiyan Buddhas, and so I wove that into the book. Zoroastrianism. I have personal experience with Zoroastrianism. My sister is married to a Zoroastrian. It's the original religion of Iran. It's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, monotheistic religion in the world. So read the book and you pick up some more details.
I mean, there is also a lot of economic foundation to the book, talking about different economic systems and other things like that that I kind of see coming through a little bit. Back there.
Yeah, so I have a question for each of you. I received a piece of advice once, or some insight, I think from my grandfather, that typically people who know a lot about intelligence and have traveled extensively, about 1/3 of the time, they probably worked for an agency of some sort. So I wonder, between you guys, who do you think, out of the other 3 gentlemen sitting next to you, is most likely to have at some point in their career worked for some agency?
Other tubes, I'll come right out and say.
That's
I am
a high
former-
hand.
Yeah, I'm easy. I'm a former practitioner, but yeah.
Oh, are you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Obviously, all of us.
Yeah, I think my vote would go to Jim. I think he's the most discreet of the 3 of us, and has a great cover. And so I'm going to vote for Jim. But
Okay, I'll second that.
Well, what did you do in Vietnam when you were over there?
I was drafted in 1975. I was in Iran. I returned, went to OCS, got a commission, and I commanded a civil affairs platoon in the city of Hue. Got there 2 weeks after the Battle of Hue. Everyone was a refugee, and I worked with refugees.
that's the official story.
Right. That's what they want us to think. Yeah.
Sounds good to me.
A statement followed by a question. I've got a good friend in the, this deals with the issue of CIA and back Cuban Missile Crisis and before and after. Got a friend in the Caribbean who's one of my best friends. His father was a Stanford engineer, now 94 years old, and early young man after college got into the concrete business down in Miami, and not to tell you who it is, but they ended up getting the contract to pave the entire Interstate 95 in Miami, so it's a big concrete company. They morphed that into a situation in the Caribbean where I've been told the CIA approached them and said, we'd like you to be everywhere in the Caribbean. And this happened over 15 years, and CIA had operatives in pretty much every island. This company went on to build every airport pretty much in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got to stop.
So my question is, after that statement.
Oh, wait, she's bringing the other one.
Okay, after that, this one's not, this one?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
So
working.
after that statement of background, this is the 50s, 60s, far simpler times. Do any of you have any insight what our CIA is doing today in hotbeds of concern, whether it's Syria, the Middle East, Pakistan, Turkey, that could give us some comfort that there's something positive on the horizon as far as what we're dealing with?
Well, you know, that's a really interesting question, and one of the big differences between the Cold War and now is that you had generations of highly educated Americans who entered the CIA and other intelligence communities having been well trained as Sovietologists, fluent Russian speakers. As students, when studying Russian, they spent time in the Soviet Union. They knew a lot about the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries by the time they went to work for our intelligence agencies. I think one of the problems, you know, if you accept the premise that that jihadism is now the biggest threat we face, it's a very different threat than the Soviet Union, starting with the fact that there is not yet a nuclear-armed jihadist country that we know of. So it's a very different type of threat. But I think one of the big problems is that the CIA and other intelligence agencies have had to pivot very abruptly away from Europe, a focus on Russia. Although you know, you still hear, one of the most interesting things is that you will hear, and I heard a talk on this just the other night at a book party I went to. You will hear a lot of people tell you, more privately than publicly, because it goes against the narrative now, the storyline, that for all of the attacks coming from jihadists, they think that China is a much bigger threat to the United States, for instance, than the jihadists ever will be. And so my guess would be, and I've pretty much been, I heard this at the Pentagon, again, off the record conversations when I covered the Pentagon. I would think that the CIA is still paying more attention, even now, to China than to jihadism. The Pentagon, I think, is paying more attention to China, and to a lesser degree, I think maybe paying more attention to Russia. And so I think you know, to be fair to the intelligence community, I think they're caught in between right now, because jihadism is a worldwide contagion. And it's kind of amorphous. It inspires lone wolf attacks that we're going to see more of. And the CIA is not particularly, our intelligence community is not particularly well positioned to infiltrate them for obvious reasons. They have to be concerned with that. At the same time, they can't take their eye off China. They can't take their eye off Russia. They can't take their eye off other major states, as opposed to stateless actors.
The question is what the threat is. And if you're talking about cyber attacks and cyber security, you're talking about China, you're talking about Russia, and a few other places. And the damage that's been done and is being done is tremendous. Economic damage, even where I work, we've been hacked several different times, and there's literally thousands of attempts each day. And they're after certain things. They're after our inventions. And they're after information about people who might be getting medical care and who are influential. So, and the banks, and this is really a big topic at the Aspen Security Forum, in which there literally are huge numbers of attacks to essentially all of our institutions, all of our banks, and many of them are successful. And I think in reality, that's probably more dangerous than the lone wolf that's going to kill 20 people or 100 people in terms of our country.
Can any one of you comment about our changing policy towards Iran and what is the future significance of this policy?
Wow.
Well, you've been in Iran.
I can if you want me to.
Why don't you
Yeah,
start?
I can if you want me to.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
I think the problem we run into is public perception versus what's happening in private. And I think that the difficulty we're going to see is that Iran as a nation can't come out publicly and embrace the United States. You still have the sheikhs and others who are going to have a hard line, great Satan, death to Israel, because that's for domestic consumption in many respects. And so they can't come out, even when you have Rouhani trying to do that. He's somewhat held on a tight leash by Khamenei. So you can only do so much. Much in the same way as the American government can't come out and say, hey, let's be friends, because the political public backlash against that would be extraordinary. We have similar problems, right? They don't like ISIS any more than we do. We have a lot of similar goals in the Middle East. We're working closer than you might see publicly. Certainly the intelligence agencies are. In some cases, the militaries are. But you're not going to see that splash across a newspaper anytime soon, because it would be political disaster for a lot of people, both either Republicans and Democrats in the United States, and it would be very problematic for those trying to maintain power in Iran, because they need this external threat to prop up this theocracy that has no real popular justification. So it's very similar to the way Russia and the United States are working together. You see all this, we're buzzing each other's ships, and they're beating up our diplomats, and there's a lot of, we're throwing out their spies, they're throwing out ours. But in the field of counterterrorism, we're working very closely together. We're passing information. There's a lot of what do we know, what do you know kind of coordination there that you're not seeing in the headlines, but it's actually happening very, very much several layers down from what you would see publicly. I think it's gotten a lot cooler, and I mean that from being ice cold or very hot, depending on what direction you want to go in. Our relations have gotten better with Iran, and it has to. This nuclear deal, for all its potential problems, has allowed for a possible opening to have further communications. That's all you really need. Look at the Cold War, right? The first summit between Gorbachev and Reagan accomplished nothing, right? The Geneva summit accomplished nothing in 1985, other than them saying, hey, maybe we can work with each other. Maybe these guys aren't these guys with horns, evil villains that we're thinking of. And then in Reykjavik, the year later, they almost agreed to eliminate all nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. Now, that didn't happen, but it got to the point where they could actually converse. And I think Cuba is going to be somewhat the same way. Once you start thawing a little bit, history takes over, and it's very difficult to get in the way of that happening. Now, you can. Tiananmen Square is a good example of getting in the way. And the Korean Revolution not happening is a good example of things getting in the way. But more than often than not, historically, once the momentum starts going, I think you're going to see it move forward. Now, it could stop. If a certain person's elected president, I'm not going to go political, you're going to see those being pulled back, right? The Iran deal ripped up, you're going to see Cuba locked up again, and there's going to be a different direction. And maybe you think that's a good idea, right? But that's going to potentially stop momentum from moving forward.
I don't pretend to be an expert on Iran, but I've been there several times, and my sister is an Iranian citizen, and she goes every year. My brother-in-law's been there for several years now, trying to take care of some family business and building a national center for, cultural center for Zoroastrianism. I will say that I've heard very clearly from them that the Iranian deal, the nuclear deal with Iran, was a tougher sell for the Iranians than it was for the Americans. And so you're right. Depending on the outcome in November, we either will have the possibility of improved relations, or we're going to go back to, we'll lose 20 years at least, if not more, in terms of Iran. The opinions of the public in Iran are changing rapidly, and I don't think the mullahs can stop it. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard can't stop it. It's going to happen.
And I saw that a couple weeks ago. I was in Cuba, and you see that there also, where the population now, they're still hesitant about criticizing the Castros in public, but in private, they call them the crazy brothers. Like, once the crazy brothers are gone, everything will be moving forward, and now that the United States are our friends, I'm like, slow down, Tiger. We're not quite there yet, but they're already starting to see the possibilities of openness. And the Persian people, for lack of a better word, the Iranian population, has never looked at the United States as the bad guy. It's always been a natural ally to the United States. And so that if politicians...
We've got a lot of baggage in
Yeah.
you know, at Mogadishu.
I think one thing I'll add quickly is that, you know, there's the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the 9/11 attacks drove Russia and the United States closer. Putin, to his credit, he was right on this. He had been warning the United States for years, and his predecessors had been warning the United States for years about the danger of extreme jihadism. He said he had it on the southern flanks of Russia and the former Soviet Union, and he said that it fell on deaf ears. He was also the first, Putin was the first international leader to call President Bush after the 9/11 attacks. Why do I mention that? I mention it because you can have two countries that are not friends, that have a history of antagonism, but get pushed together by external events. And I think that, you know, Iran is a Shiite country, and the rise of Sunni extremism, the failure of the Saudi government and the Pakistani government to completely control Sunni extremism, and you could say even go further with that. Depending on what happens in the future, I mean, let's remember one thing. The Germans were our arch enemies for a decade, before and during World War II. But then when the Soviet threat we perceived the Soviet threat as greater, they were all of a sudden, almost overnight, our allies. And if Sunni extremism continues to spread, and the Sunni governments continue to fail to stop it, then I think that Iran and the United States will be pushed closer together by events.
So a little bit of what Putin was saying was trying to justify crushing and setting Chechnya back to the Stone Age, but yeah, you're definitely right.
Nobody's motives are pure when you come to world leaders. No.
So on that note, what I want to do is to thank the three men here on stage, James Rosen, Curtis Harris, and James Ellenberger, for joining us here tonight. Would you be willing to sign some books in the back of the room? So I will send them to the rear, so please join me in thanking them for taking the time to come out here tonight.